John F. Kennedy and his entire family have become something of a myth in American history. First Lady Jackie Kennedy was young, beautiful, and charming, and JFK was young, handsome, at least according to presidential standards, and idealistic. He had a new vision for the country that sparked excitement and awe in young people, especially the boomers. But we forget that Kennedy was only in office for 2.5 years. Like, I have a bottle of fancy face moisturizer that has lasted longer than the entire Kennedy administration. Where did Kennedy come from, and how did he seemingly rocket to the presidency in 1960? It's funny because in my mind, JFK is infinitely younger, like from an entirely different generation than curmudgeonly Richard Nixon, but that's not true. Nixon is just 4 years older than JFK, and their career is actually parallel in many ways. Kennedy and Nixon were both elected to Congress in the same year, 1946, after they both served in World War II. Before serving as Eisenhower's VP, Nixon gained fame for being tough on communists during the McCarthy era, and he actually helped uncover a real Soviet spy, Alger Hiss. So when the election of 1960 came around, Nixon was the candidate with substance. And he had a good story. He had worked his way from a poor Quaker family in California to the second highest office in the country. And Kennedy was a very handsome man who got a sailboat for his 15th birthday and whose dad financed his first congressional campaign, saying, quote, "With the money I spent, I could have elected my chauffeur." Nice. I'm not saying Kennedy wasn't smart and capable and a good candidate, but to me, Kennedy is the quintessential modern politician. He understands the aesthetics of the presidency. He knows how to say the right words, and he knows how to surround himself with really smart people, and then, take the credit when it all goes well. Well, it seems pretty clear amongst historians that JFK won the presidency because of this newfangled thing called the television. And that's not to say he wasn't a good candidate otherwise, but when it came down to Kennedy and Nixon, Nixon actually had way more substance and political clout. And without television, Kennedy would not have won the election in 1960. After the first ever televised debate, it's actually the first ever presidential debate, period, voters were polled on who they thought won. Those who watched on TV overwhelmingly chose JFK, but those who listened on the radio chose Nixon by a landslide. JFK didn't actually say a lot, but he looked presidential while saying it. And that was on purpose. His team had done testing to see which suit and tie would look the best against the background. He stared straight into the camera while speaking. Meanwhile, Nixon was sweaty. He was recovering from an illness. He'd recently hurt his knee, so he kept leaning on the podium and shifting his weight back and forth. Now, this one TV debate didn't convince millions, but it convinced just enough undecided voters to elect the Democrat. JFK won the presidency by just 100,000 votes, and the most cohesive voting bloc that swung his way was Southern Democrats. Remember, this group is very important. The Democratic Party is still super weird. It's still that mismatched coalition of voters who all benefited from FDR's New Deal. Labor unions, urban intellectuals, farmers, rural white Southerners, and racial minorities, all in the same party. And JFK knew that without the support of these white Southern Democrats, he would not have won the presidency. And he knew that if he lost their support, he would lose re-election. Which brings us to my question. How liberal was JFK? I feel like we have this image of JFK as a young, vibrant president for a new generation. Like anytime a young, handsome man runs for office with new ideas appealing to young people, he's compared to Kennedy. But when you look at Kennedy's record, he didn't accomplish as much as you might think. In fact, LBJ actually accomplished a lot more that we sometimes credit to JFK. And there's even more stuff, especially with civil rights, that he didn't even try to do because he was scared of losing support of Southern Democrats. Those white segregationists who were fine voting Democrat as long as it was understood that the federal government would stay out of their state business. Oppressing black people. So in what ways was JFK liberal in the modern sense? He raised the minimum wage. His Housing Act built low-income homes in poor areas. He proposed health insurance for senior citizens and federal aid to education, but both were blocked by Congress. Most interesting to me is that JFK created the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, headed by Eleanor Roosevelt. This would be her last project as mother of the Democratic Party. And the commission eventually called for action against gender discrimination, and it affirmed the right of women to be paid equally. Does that happen right away? No, but it affirmed the right. In 1963, JFK signed the Equal Pay Act, and although it didn't immediately raise the pay of women who were facing workplace discrimination, it did provide a legal basis that is going to be really useful to the growing feminist movement. More on that in a few episodes. It does seem that he personally supported liberal causes like the civil rights movement. When he could, he encouraged his executive branch to submit briefs on behalf of civil rights cases, and he supported voter registration drives. But generally, he had hoped to be non-committal enough that he wouldn't make white Southern voters angry. He wanted to promote his New Frontier platform. The idea was to showcase the best of what the US has to offer as a positive option for the world against Soviet oppression. Unfortunately for this vision, the television that helped him get elected was also broadcasting Black Revolution against white supremacy at the same time, so sort of a hard sell to some people. On the topic of the Cold War, JFK advocated a flexible response. Eisenhower had invested in the nuclear arms race and pushed the Soviets to the brink in the hopes of avoiding traditional military confrontation. JFK believed that the US should have more tools than just the military. For example, he promoted aid projects in Latin America to stabilize their economies and hopefully make leftist movements less appealing. Over 10 years, the US gave $20 billion to his Latin America Alliance for Progress to establish schools, housing, healthcare, and land redistribution. Now, it's unclear how successful this program was. A lot of the money seems to have gone to corrupt governments. JFK also founded the Peace Corps. Let's send out our bright, idealistic young people to build wells and teach kids in developing nations that the US is nice. But the two elements of the Cold War that JFK is most associated with is the space race and Cuba. In 1961, 1 year into his presidency, Soviet Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth, and we freaked out. That year, JFK famously announced, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon." I need to work on my Kennedy, but 1 year later, John Glenn was orbiting Earth. USA, USA. And by the end of the decade, we would land a man on the moon. Although really, the entire push for space exploration was really the passion project of his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. But both JFK's biggest failure and his biggest victory came on the island of Cuba. All right, world history context. Cuba had been this unofficial territory of the US since the Spanish-American War in 1898. They were independent, but, we helped write their constitution. And we included that Platt Amendment that had said that, among other things, the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence. Wait, but if the US intervenes to preserve independence, isn't our intervention a violation of their independence? Don't worry about it. Cuba became the playground of rich Americans. The mafia literally held a conference in Havana in 1946. By the 1950s, Cuba was under the US-backed Batista dictatorship. Inequality was off the charts, and foreign interests dominated the country and its environment and resources. So in 1959, Fidel Castro led the Cuban Revolution. It forced many to flee the island. He killed his opponents, but it also transformed Cuba into a totalitarian socialist state. We just call them communists because it's shorter. And it was just 90 miles from the United States. As soon as Castro came to power, the CIA started plotting ways to get him out of power. Between the growing Cuban exile community in Florida and billions of dollars in federal funding, the CIA under Eisenhower concocted the Bay of Pigs invasion. They would train and arm 1,400 Cuban exiles, along with a few American soldiers, to land on a beach in Cuba and instigate a popular revolt against Castro. The real problem with the Bay of Pigs wasn't the plan itself, it was the fact that it spanned two very different presidencies. This plan was a classic example of Eisenhower's brinkmanship, directly challenge a new Soviet ally, assuming they were not going to step in to support Cuba. But Kennedy was trying for a softer approach. He wanted to make the US the good guy to the Soviets' bad guy. So, under the new President Kennedy, the brigade landed overnight and at first overwhelmed the local militia around the Bay of Pigs. But Castro quickly took back control, and the next morning, as the world learned about the invasion, Kennedy chose not to send air and naval support like they'd planned. He was hoping that no one would find out the US had been involved. Kennedy, it was pretty obvious. The invasion was a massive failure. The American-backed Cuban rebels were defeated within 3 days, and those who hadn't been killed in the fighting were sent to Cuban prisons. The invasion also solidified Castro as a national hero who defended the island from the Americans. Whoops. It was clear that Kennedy was looking to take a different approach from Harry Atomic Bomb Truman and Dwight D. Brinkmanship Eisenhower. And this strategy was on full display with his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, for more detail about the event itself, check out my podcast episode all about it. But long story short, JFK sent ships to block Soviet missiles from arriving in Cuba. He called it a naval quarantine to avoid the more militant term blockade. Synonyms. They're the real heroes of the story. Meanwhile, JFK's brother/Attorney General Bobby Kennedy was secretly negotiating with the Soviets. In the end, the Soviets dismantled the missiles on Cuba if the US guaranteed it would never invade the island again. And then secretly, Bobby Kennedy had also arranged for US missiles in Turkey to be dismantled within the next 6 months, which the Soviets wanted. The big takeaway is that JFK's diplomatic approach, supported by his brother, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy's backdoor negotiations with the Soviets, helped defuse the event that got the world closer to a nuclear event than ever before. But JFK was faced with more than just a looming nuclear apocalypse. We're going to get way more into the Vietnam War soon, but for now, let's just try to understand what the situation was like in Southeast Asia by the end of Kennedy's presidency. World War II sparked decolonization movements around the world, including one in Vietnam led by Ho Chi Minh against French imperialism. By 1954, for reference, that's just 1 year before Rosa Parks sparked the Montgomery bus boycotts, the French forces lost at Dien Bien Phu, and it was clear that they were going to have to withdraw from their colony. Unfortunately, dismantling French Indochina was slightly complicated since, the Cold War was raging. The US and the Soviets thought, we'll just divide Vietnam in half. Sure, it failed miserably in Berlin and Korea, but third time's a charm, right? They divided the new country at the 17th parallel with Ho Chi Minh in charge of the North, now a communist state backed by the Soviets and China, and Diem's anti-communist regime in South Vietnam. They scheduled elections in 1954 that would reunite the country, but yeah, those didn't happen. Now let me address something. Korea and Vietnam are really similar in a lot of ways. Both were former colonies that were divided up as pawns in the Cold War conflict, with a communist North and an anti-communist South. But Vietnam is different from Korea in a pretty important way, because while the Kim regime in North Korea was, and still is, undoubtedly brutal and oppressive, Ho Chi Minh's government in the North was actually really popular across Vietnam. And Diem, the president of South Vietnam propped up by the US, was a really unpopular leader. For one, he was a Catholic who persecuted the Buddhist majority. This is where that famous footage comes from of the Buddhist monk setting himself on fire in protest. And unlike in Korea, where the communist North was the one who sparked the conflict by invading, in Vietnam, Diem refused to hold elections because he knew Ho Chi Minh would probably win. So after refusing to hold elections, Eisenhower increased aid to South Vietnam. Remember, the Cold War is more about having governments who are friendly to the US than it is about democracy or freedom. Meanwhile, Ho Chi Minh began organizing a resistance movement to reunify the country, including many South Vietnamese people who wanted out of Diem's dictatorship. A lot of these people would go on to become the Viet Cong. So when JFK came into office, he increased the US presence in South Vietnam from 2,000 to 15,000. Now, all of these were so-called military advisors. There were no active US troops in Vietnam. And to be clear, the general public was really not paying much attention to any of this. Remember, this is all happening at the same time as growing civil rights protests, Castro's revolution in Cuba, JFK's election, the Bay of Pigs, etc., etc. The US sending some advisors to South Vietnam was pretty low on the list of concerns for most Americans. A lot of things changed in 1963 when a group of Vietnamese generals plotted to overthrow Diem. JFK, knowing that this ally was incredibly unpopular, went along with the coup and supported the generals as they overthrew and executed Diem. But all of a sudden, there was a power vacuum in South Vietnam as Ho Chi Minh loomed in the north and the Viet Cong were building up defenses throughout the southern countryside. What else happened in 1963? Oh yeah, and JFK was assassinated 3 weeks after Diem was killed. Whoa, hold on. So LBJ is going to be sworn in as president 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis put us closer than ever to nuclear war, 3 months after 250,000 people march on Washington demanding racial justice, 1 month after 4 young black girls were killed in a church in Birmingham, and 3 weeks after the US supported a coup that left our ally vulnerable to communist attack? Whew, good luck, Johnson. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.